The town of Millbrook seemed to breathe in its own quiet rhythm. The hum of life pulsing through its well-worn streets and whispered around quaint storefronts. For nearly 2 decades, Officer John Harris had driven these roads, his cruiser a familiar sight to townsfolk who waved with friendly indifference, trusting him to keep watch over their sleepy community. This particular autumn evening, as crisp leaves danced along the pavement and the sun cast an amber glow over the town, John felt a pang of loneliness settle into the pit of his stomach. It had been 10 years since Sarah, his wife, had passed, and every year since had only deepened the silence of his empty house. His life had become a quiet cycle of patrols, reports, and solitary dinners, a life he'd come to accept as his own. As he drove down Main Street, Mrs. Thompson waved from her flower shop, a bright smile lighting up her wrinkled face. "See you at the church picnic, John," she called as he rolled down the window, her voice laced with hopeful cheer. "Maybe, Mrs. Thompson. Duty calls, you know." He managed a small smile in return. But even she seemed to sense the hesitation in his voice, her eyes softening with understanding. He was about to continue his patrol when the crackle of the radio snapped him from his thoughts. "All units, we have a situation at 1456 Elm Street. Possible abandonment case involving multiple minors. Proceed with caution." John's grip tightened on the steering wheel. Abandonment. He'd handled dozens of calls over the years. But each time he heard that word, a knot twisted in his stomach. It was a cold, cruel thing to leave children alone in a world already brimming with enough hardship. He pressed the siren, lights flashing as he sped toward Elm Street. The house loomed in the distance. A small, dilapidated structure sagging with years of neglect, paint peeled in long strips. And the front yard was littered with scattered toys, hinting at life within. As he approached, he could hear it, a faint, muffled sound that clawed at his heart. Crying. "Police," John called as he knocked on the door, his voice gentle but firm. "Is anyone home?" The crying intensified, and John's instincts kicked in. Slowly, he turned the handle, pushing the door open. Inside, the room was dim, sparse, and heartbreakingly bare, with nothing but a single, worn couch and stacks of old magazines cluttering the floor. And there, in the far corner of the room, huddled together like lost lambs, were 6 young girls, their faces pale and eyes wide with fear. John knelt, lowering himself to their level, hoping to ease the fear etched into their expressions. "Hey there," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm here to help. Can one of you tell me what happened?" The oldest girl, maybe 11 or 12, stepped forward, her braided hair neatly arranged despite the disarray around her. She held her sisters close, a protective arm draped over the smallest one, who looked no more than 3 years old. The girl swallowed hard, her eyes glistening. "Our parents, there was an accident. They didn't come home," she said, her voice cracking as her sisters clung to her tightly, their small hands gripping her arms and clothes like she was their only anchor in the world. John's heart broke right there. These were not just children, they were orphans now, lost and adrift, and he could see the terror in their eyes as they looked up at him, desperate for some sign of hope. In the next few hours, social workers arrived, their voices hushed as they assessed the situation, whispering words like foster care and placement. John overheard the social workers' conversations, difficult to keep all 6 together. Older ones will be hard to place, and cultural challenges. The words felt cold and clinical, like a barrier they were erecting between these girls and any chance of staying together. As John listened, a wave of something fierce and unyielding rose within him, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. Not since Sarah had been alive. He wasn't sure where the words came from, but before he even realized he was speaking, they were out. What if I took them? The room fell silent. The social workers looked at him, eyes wide with disbelief, and even John felt his heart skip a beat. He hadn't planned this, it hadn't crossed his mind until now. But as he met the gaze of each girl, he felt a certainty settle over him, a strange but resolute peace. One of the social workers, Linda, a kind-looking woman with kind, watchful eyes, approached him cautiously. "Officer Harris, taking in 6 children, it's a massive responsibility. Especially considering, well, the cultural differences. These girls, they would need someone who understands their background. Someone who, I understand, John interrupted, his voice steady. I know I can't replace their parents. And I don't know all the challenges they'll face. But I do know one thing. I can't bear the thought of them being separated. I have room in my heart and in my home. The oldest girl stepped forward, her eyes wide and uncertain. Are we going to be okay? She asked. Her voice barely above a whisper. John knelt down once more, looking into her eyes. What's your name? Amara, she replied, her voice trembling. Well, Amara, I don't have all the answers. But I promise you this. I'll do everything I can to keep you and your sisters together. Can you be brave for me? Amara nodded, her grip on her sister's tightening, her face softening as she looked back at him with something like hope. And in that moment, surrounded by 6 young girls in a small, worn-down room, John Harris knew his life would never be the same. He was no longer just a small-town cop. He was about to become something else entirely. The house was quiet, too quiet. John had brought home 6 girls, each with their own guarded gaze and uncertain smile. And the enormity of it hit him as soon as he opened the door. This once silent home, with its worn furniture and faded wallpaper, was now filled with tiny footsteps and cautious whispers. Amara, the oldest, held her sisters close as they stepped inside, her eyes flickering between the dusty frames on the walls and the shadows cast in the corners of the room. John cleared his throat, trying to keep his voice steady. This is your home now. Girls, you're safe here. But silence hung thick in the air. Each of them seemed to clutch their bags like lifelines, afraid to let go, as if dropping them would sever their last connection to the life they'd left behind. Okay, let's see, John said, rubbing his hands together with forced cheer. How about a little tour? He motioned down the hallway. There are 3 rooms over here, 2 of you will share each room. He glanced at Amara, who seemed to understand the weight of his unspoken question. I'll share with Jasmine and Tiana, she said, lifting her chin with a maturity beyond her 12 years. Sounds like a plan. He shot her a small smile, nodding. All right, let's get you all settled in. As they moved through the house, each girl's face remained expressionless, as if they were afraid to let any feeling show. John noticed how Zoe, the 6-year-old bookworm, lingered by the small bookshelf in the hallway, her fingers brushing against the spines. And Tiana, the 8-year-old athlete, immediately honed in on the backyard, her eyes lighting up at the sight of an old basketball hoop swaying in the wind. Once the tour was over, John showed them to their rooms. He felt like an outsider, unsure of how to bridge the gap between them. As he handed out blankets and pillows, he glanced at his watch. 8:30. Back in his solitary days, he would have already been finishing up the news and drifting off to sleep. But tonight, the prospect of silence seemed impossible. He took a deep breath and knocked gently on the door of Amara, Jasmine, and Tiana's room. Everyone doing okay in here? Amara looked up, giving a slight nod. Jasmine clutched a stuffed animal, a worn bunny missing one of its ears, and Tiana sat cross-legged on the bed, picking at a loose thread on her jeans. Listen, John began, his voice softer than usual. I know this is strange. It's new for all of us. But I want you to know that whatever you're feeling, it's okay. He hesitated, the words coming harder than he expected. This house may be quiet now, but there's room here for noise, for laughter, for you to just be yourselves. The girls remained silent, but he could see their guarded expressions soften just a little. Then, breaking the silence, Tiana looked up at him with a question he hadn't expected. Do you know how to braid hair? The question hung in the air, and for a moment, John was speechless. Braids? He scratched his head. Well, I suppose I could try? Tiana's lips curled into a slight smile, and Jasmine giggled, a sound that felt like music in the stillness. Okay, you know what? John said, straightening up. Let's make this a challenge. You bring me some brushes, some ties, and I'll do my best. Deal? They nodded, and he followed them to the living room, where the girls huddled around him, placing their trust in his clumsy fingers. He quickly realized that his fingers weren't nearly as skilled as he thought. After what felt like 100 tries, he managed to create something resembling a braid crooked and loose. But it was a start. As he looked down at Jasmine, her messy braid framing her small, dimpled face, he felt an unfamiliar warmth spread through him. The sound of laughter, genuine, light, and unburdened, echoed in the room. And John couldn't help but chuckle too. That night, as he finally turned off the lights, the house wasn't filled with the oppressive silence he'd grown used to. Instead, there were soft murmurs, quiet giggles, and the shuffling of blankets as each girl found her place in their new rooms. But the challenges came fast. The next morning, he woke to a whirlwind of chatter and chaos. Breakfast, which was once a quick cup of coffee and toast, now meant cereal spills, debates over who got the last slice of toast, and a tangled mess of hairbrushes and missing shoes. Tiana looked exasperated as she tried to tie her sneakers, while Zoe, nose buried in a book, walked straight into the kitchen table. Okay, hold on. John raised his hands, feeling both overwhelmed and strangely energized. Let's try this one at a time. Tiana, I'll help with the shoes. Zoe, maybe reading can wait until after breakfast? Amara appeared at his elbow, arms crossed but a hint of amusement in her eyes. Dad, she said, her voice tentative but steady, you're going to have to move faster if you want to keep up with us. The word, Dad, stopped him in his tracks. It was the first time any of them had used it, and it hit him harder than he'd expected. He swallowed, then managed a small smile. All right, point taken. Breakfast boot camp, let's go. Despite the chaos, he couldn't remember the last time he'd felt so alive. At work, his partner Mike pulled him aside, glancing over his shoulder to make sure no one was within earshot. You really adopted 6 kids? Mike asked, eyes wide. John shrugged, trying to keep his voice nonchalant. Yeah, well, they needed a home. It's nothing heroic. Nothing heroic? Mike shook his head in disbelief. John, that's insane. They're kids. He hesitated. They're black kids. You're not worried about, the differences? John looked his friend squarely in the eye. I'm not pretending to understand everything, but I know they deserve to be loved. They deserve a family. Mike sighed, running a hand through his hair. All right, just be careful. You're in deep. But John didn't care. The doubts, the hesitations, he pushed them aside. These girls were his now. They'd already burrowed into his heart, and he was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. By the time he came home that night, he found Amara helping Zoe with her homework, Tiana tossing a basketball to herself in the backyard, and Jasmine fast asleep on the couch, her thumb curled in her mouth. For the first time, the house felt like a home. As John leaned against the doorframe, watching them, he knew he was all in whatever it took. He would make sure these girls grew up knowing they were loved, knowing they had a place in the world. The sun rose slowly over Millbrook, casting a golden light over the quiet town and illuminating John's home, which was now far from quiet. Mornings had taken on a new shape, filled with the rustling of blankets, the clang of pots and pans, and the ceaseless chorus of voices as 6 girls prepared for school. John stood in the kitchen, flipping pancakes while Tiana and Zoe scrambled to finish last-minute homework at the table. Amara, ever the responsible eldest, was wrestling a stubborn hair tie into Jasmine's curls, while Simone sketched idly on a napkin. Breakfast was no longer a peaceful affair, it was loud, messy, and utterly chaotic, yet John found himself smiling, feeling an energy he hadn't known in years. As the girls bolted down their breakfast, John cleared his throat. Today's going to be a little different, he said, catching their attention. I thought it might be nice to introduce you all to the community a bit more. Meet some people who'd love to get to know you. He saw Amara's brow furrow slightly, her eyes casting a protective glance over her sisters. The idea of stepping into a community that still felt foreign was daunting. And he knew it, but he also knew they'd have to face it eventually. It wasn't just about meeting the townsfolk, it was about showing his girls that Millbrook could be their town. 2. After school, he took the girls to the town's community church, a historic building with whitewashed walls and a tall steeple that caught the sunlight. Inside, people gathered in warm clusters, laughter and conversation filling the air. John felt the weight of curious glances as they entered, eyes flicking from him to the girls who clung close, uncertain of their welcome. Mother Henrietta, a respected elder of the church with a presence that seemed to command the very air around her, approached them. She was a small woman but radiated a quiet strength, her eyes sharp yet kind. She looked at John, then down at the 6 girls standing beside him, and her face softened. "Well now, you must be Officer Harris girls," she said, her voice warm and inviting. "I've heard about you all. Welcome to our community." She extended a hand, which Amara hesitantly shook, eyeing the woman with a blend of suspicion and curiosity. John held his breath, watching for any sign of rejection or disapproval. But Mother Henrietta's smile only grew as she looked each girl in the eye. "You're all welcome here. This is your home, too. And I hope you'll always feel that way." Amara's posture eased, and she let out a small, almost imperceptible sigh. John saw her shoulders loosen, as if she'd been carrying the weight of doubt on them. And now, bit by bit, it was being lifted. The service that followed was unlike anything John had ever experienced. The music was loud and vibrant, each note reverberating through the room, and the congregation sang with voices that filled the rafters. The girls, who had been so hesitant moments before, were now clapping and swaying to the music, their faces alight with the joy of something familiar and comforting. He watched them, feeling like an outsider, but determined to understand. This was a part of their heritage, their world, a world that was becoming his, too. He didn't fully understand it, but he wanted to. He wanted to know everything that mattered to them, everything that made them feel whole. After the service, Mother Henrietta approached him, her eyes knowing as she looked him up and down. "Officer Harris," she began, "you've taken on a tremendous responsibility. Raising these girls, it's a path that will test you, challenge you in ways you might not expect." "I know," he replied, his voice quieter than he intended. "I may not know everything, but I know this feels right." Mother Henrietta gave a slight nod. "That's good, but remember, there will be things you may not be able to teach them. Not because you don't want to, but because you haven't lived it. You're their father now, and a good one, I believe, but there are experiences in this world that are different for these girls." She took his hand in hers, her grip unexpectedly strong. "Bring them here. Let them see faces that look like theirs. Hear voices that understand their hearts. And don't hesitate to lean on this community. We'll be here for you." John felt a mix of gratitude and humility wash over him. He wasn't just trying to keep these girls safe, he was trying to help them feel at home in a world that could sometimes feel unwelcoming. The days turned into weeks, and he made a point of bringing the girls to church every Sunday. Slowly, they grew comfortable with the people who gathered there, who welcomed them with warm smiles and open arms. He saw each girl begin to bloom in her own way, her spirit strengthened by the sense of belonging that the community offered. Yet despite these moments of acceptance, challenges continued to creep in from the edges. The girls faced taunts at school, whispered comments from classmates who questioned their real family. Tiana, his fierce little athlete, was the first to tell him. "They say we don't belong together," she muttered one evening after dinner, picking at the edge of her plate. "They say we're not a real family because we don't look the same." John felt anger simmering beneath the surface, but he pushed it down, focusing instead on the pain etched in her face. "People don't always understand what they haven't experienced," he said, choosing his words carefully. "But listen to me, Tiana, we are a real family. Not because of how we look, but because of how we love." She looked up at him, her eyes wide and searching. And in that moment, John knew he would have to be her unwavering source of strength. They all needed him to be. Later that night, he found Amara sitting on the front porch, gazing out at the quiet street. She looked so small, her arms wrapped around her knees, her chin resting on them. He joined her, sitting silently until she finally spoke. Sometimes I wonder if things would have been easier if we'd been adopted by someone who looked like us," she whispered, her voice barely audible. John's heart ached, but he didn't shy away from her honesty. "I know I can't be everything, Amara. I know I'll never fully understand what you feel or what you'll face. But I can promise you this, I'll be here, every step of the way." And I'll do everything I can to make sure you have a place where you feel loved and understood. Amara looked at him, and for the first time, he saw a glimmer of trust in her eyes. Thank you, she whispered, resting her head on his shoulder. As the weeks passed, John threw himself into creating a home that reflected both who he was and who his daughters were. He read books on Black culture, watched documentaries on civil rights, and asked Mother Henrietta questions that filled in the gaps in his understanding. He stocked the house with books, music, and art that resonated with the girls, creating a home that was as much theirs as it was his. One Sunday after church, he joined the girls in the kitchen to make Sunday dinner. As they cooked, he saw Zoe grinning as she stirred a pot of collard greens, her small hands mimicking Mother Henrietta's cooking instructions. Simone was laughing as she mashed sweet potatoes, her artistic flair somehow translating even into cooking, while Amara showed him how to season the chicken just right. That night, as they gathered around the table, John looked at each of his daughters, their faces alight with laughter, their hearts finally finding rest within these walls. He felt it in his bones. In his soul, this was family, not bound by blood, but by something far stronger. The whispers, the taunts, the doubts, they couldn't touch what they had built here. In this house, they had found something unbreakable, something that would carry them through every storm that might come. And as he listened to the girls tell stories, their voices mingling with the clatter of dishes and bursts of laughter, John felt, for the first time in a long time, that he was exactly where he was meant to be. The first hint that something was wrong came in the form of a note crumpled in the bottom of Tiana's backpack. John found it when he was clearing the kitchen table after dinner. A small, torn piece of lined paper that had slipped out and fallen to the floor. Scribbled in clumsy handwriting were the words, "You don't belong here. Go back where you came from." John felt a cold, sinking feeling in his stomach as he read the words. He knew his girls would face challenges, but he'd hoped it wouldn't be this soon. And he'd hoped they'd never have to face this kind of cruel ignorance. He took a steadying breath, determined not to let his anger cloud his thoughts. "Girls," he called softly. Tiana and Amara looked up from the couch, their faces instantly guarded when they saw the note in his hand. Tiana's eyes darted to the floor, shame and frustration mingling in her expression. "I didn't want you to see that," she mumbled, crossing her arms tightly. John sat down beside her, keeping his voice as calm as he could manage. "When did this happen?" "It was in my locker yesterday," she replied, barely looking up. "It's no big deal, Dad. It's just kids being kids." But John could see the hurt flickering behind her eyes, the way her shoulders tensed. And he knew it was more than just a note. It was a reminder that, to some, she and her sisters were seen as different, as outsiders. "It is a big deal," he said gently, "and I'm sorry you had to deal with that, Tiana. But listen to me, this doesn't define you. You and your sisters have just as much right to be here as anyone else." Tiana nodded, her face softening, but the hurt remained, lingering like a bruise beneath the surface. She offered a small, sad smile, as if she were trying to be brave for his sake. And John's heart broke a little more. The next day, he took the girls to school himself, watching as they hesitated before heading into the building. The sight of their backs disappearing through the double doors weighed on him. He could shield them from so many things, but he couldn't protect them from this, not entirely. By the end of the week, the strain was beginning to show. Tiana, his fearless little athlete, had stopped talking about basketball practice. Zoe, normally buried in a book, was quieter than usual, her brow furrowed as if she were trying to disappear into herself. And Amara, his steady, responsible eldest, had become even more withdrawn, her guarded look making it clear she felt the weight of responsibility to shield her sisters. John decided it was time for action. After dinner, he gathered the girls in the living room, their faces a mix of curiosity and worry. He cleared his throat, the weight of what he wanted to say heavy on his chest. "I know things have been hard," he began, choosing his words carefully. "I know you've been dealing with things no child should have to face. And I want you to know that I see you. I see your strength, your courage, and I'm proud of each and every one of you." The girls looked at him, their eyes wide and attentive. And he continued, We're going to find ways to face this together. You're not alone in this, you never have to be alone. Amara's expression softened, and he saw the smallest flicker of relief in her eyes, as if a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. That Sunday, they went to church as usual. But John had made an arrangement. He pulled Mother Henrietta aside after the service, explaining what the girls were going through, the challenges they were facing. She listened quietly, nodding, her face a mask of empathy and understanding. The following Saturday, she invited them over for a small gathering at her house. John wasn't sure what to expect, but he trusted Mother Henrietta and her wisdom. The moment they arrived, John felt the warmth of community all around them. The house was filled with the scents of freshly cooked food, and laughter floated in from the living room. People of all ages were there, friends and family members of Mother Henrietta, each one smiling in welcome. As the girls entered, they were greeted with open arms, enveloped in hugs and friendly smiles. Faces like theirs, voices that carried a familiar rhythm and cadence, welcomed them in a way that was both comforting and empowering. John watched as Amara and Tiana found their way to a circle of older girls who pulled them into a game of cards. Simone and Zoe were sitting with a group of women who admired Simone's latest sketches, praising her talent and creativity. Little Jasmine clung to Mother Henrietta's side, her wide eyes taking in the lively scene with a mix of awe and excitement. John lingered by the doorway, watching his daughters slowly relax into the atmosphere, the tension easing from their faces as they laughed, shared stories, and found themselves surrounded by people who understood them in ways he might never fully grasp. "John," Mother Henrietta said, joining him by the door, her eyes filled with pride. "These girls needed this, and I dare say, you needed it too." He nodded, feeling a lump rise in his throat. "I want them to feel at home," he managed to say, his voice rough with emotion. "I want them to feel like they belong." Mother Henrietta placed a hand on his shoulder. "You're doing right by them, John. They'll find their way, and when they stumble, you'll be there to help them stand tall again." As the gathering continued, John noticed that each of his daughters seemed to come alive in a new way. They were smiling, laughing with a kind of ease he hadn't seen in them for weeks. This place, this community, was giving them a piece of their identity back, a foundation that would help them face the world with pride. As they prepared to leave, Mother Henrietta pulled Amara aside, her eyes filled with a wisdom and strength that only came from a lifetime of facing the world with resilience. "Remember, child, you are strong. You come from a long line of strong people, and that strength lives in you. Don't ever let anyone make you feel small or unworthy." Amara nodded, her face resolute, and John could see a new confidence in her eyes as they walked back to the car. Each girl carried a piece of that strength with them now, a foundation that no hateful words could shake. On Monday morning, as John watched them walk into school, he saw a difference in their steps. Their heads were held a little higher, their shoulders a little straighter. They knew now that they belonged, not just to him, but to a community that cherished them, that saw them for who they truly were. When Tiana returned home that afternoon, she was breathless with excitement. She'd been invited to join the basketball team, and her eyes sparkled with pride as she told him the news. Zoe, too, had made a friend in her class who shared her love for books, and she talked animatedly over dinner about all the books they planned to read together. That night, as he tucked Jasmine into bed, she wrapped her tiny arms around his neck, her voice sleepy but content. "Daddy," she murmured, "we're lucky, aren't we?" John smiled, feeling his heart swell with love. "Yes, sweetheart, we're very lucky." As he closed her door, he thought about all the trials they'd faced, the challenges that lay ahead, and the strength he saw in his daughters every single day. They had a long road ahead of them, but he knew that together, they could face anything. For the first time, he felt a deep, unshakable certainty that his family would not only survive, but thrive. They were strong, they were resilient, and no matter what adversity came their way, they would face it together, bound by love and an unbreakable spirit. As the weeks turned into months, John began to notice the distinct rhythms of each of his daughters' personalities. The girls were blossoming, each developing interests and dreams that filled the house with a new kind of music. Amara, ever the caretaker, gravitated toward helping her younger sisters with schoolwork. Simone, the artist, turned the kitchen into a makeshift studio. Her sketches and watercolors scattered across the table. Tiana's afternoons were devoted to basketball practice, while Zoe hid behind books she devoured by the dozen. Layla, the performer, could often be found humming a tune. And Jasmine, the youngest, was the family's peacemaker, always seeking to smooth over any sisterly squabbles. One Friday evening, John gathered them in the living room, clearing his throat as he looked at each of them. Girls, I know we're all getting settled into routines, and everyone's finding their own path. He began, but I want to learn more about what's important to each of you. About where you come from, what your heritage means to you. The girls exchanged glances, a mix of surprise and curiosity in their eyes. I may not understand everything, John continued, his voice gentle, but I want to. I want you to feel proud of who you are, not just as my daughters, but as strong young women connected to something bigger than all of us. Amara's eyes softened, and she gave a small nod, understanding the weight of what John was trying to convey. There are a lot of things we could teach you, Dad, she said with a slight smile. But maybe we can all learn together. They started small. John brought home books by Black authors and borrowed documentaries from the library, filling their evenings with stories of civil rights heroes, groundbreaking artists, and trailblazing women who had shaped history. They watched movies and read books together, John's heart swelling as he saw his daughter's eyes light up with pride and excitement. One Sunday, Mother Henrietta invited them over to her house for what she called a cultural potluck. The house was filled with the rich aromas of collard greens, cornbread, and sweet potatoes. As they gathered around the table, John found himself trying dishes he'd never tasted before, flavors that felt like a bridge between his daughter's heritage and his own desire to connect with them on a deeper level. Layla, who'd always been fascinated by stories, sat beside Mother Henrietta, listening to her recount tales of her own childhood in the South. Stories laced with resilience, strength, and humor. These roots run deep, child, Mother Henrietta said, placing a gentle hand on Layla's shoulder. Never forget where you come from, or who paved the way for you to be here. After the meal, they gathered in the living room, where one of the older men from the church, Mr. Brooks, pulled out a worn Bible and recited a passage he said had guided him through the hardest times. He spoke about the strength that came from family, community, and faith, reminding the girls that they were part of something much larger than themselves. When they returned home that night, there was a renewed energy in the air, a sense of connectedness that lingered in the house like a gentle warmth. John felt it, too, a pride and respect for the culture his daughters were rooted in. He was learning alongside them, seeing the world through their eyes, and he knew it was shaping him into a better father. As the weeks went by, he made small but meaningful changes in the house. Family photos of the girls adorned the walls, their smiles radiant against backdrops of their favorite places. Books by Black poets and activists lined the shelves, and the dining room table became a place of both nourishment and storytelling, where they shared their dreams and challenges without fear or reservation. One evening, as the girls sat around the table finishing their homework, John joined them, clearing his throat. I was thinking, he began, we could go to the city this weekend. There's a museum exhibit on African American history, and I thought we could all check it out together. The girls looked at him, their faces a mix of surprise and excitement. Tiana grinned, her eyes bright. I'd love that, Dad, she said, and one by one, the others echoed her sentiment. That Saturday, they piled into the car and headed to the city. The museum was vast, with rooms filled with photos, artifacts, and stories of people who had fought, sacrificed, and triumphed against incredible odds. John watched as the girls moved through the exhibits, their eyes wide with wonder and respect. He saw Amara linger by a photograph of a civil rights protest, her expression thoughtful and somber. Zoe was captivated by the poetry section, her fingers grazing the worn pages of a collection by Langston Hughes. Simone stood transfixed by a painting, a portrait of a young girl her own age, her face defiant and proud. Simone reached out, tracing the air just above the canvas, as if connecting with a piece of herself she hadn't fully understood before. John felt a hand slip into his. And looked down to see Jasmine. Her small face glowing with excitement. "This is amazing. Daddy," she whispered. "It's like seeing a story of who we are." When they returned home that evening, the girls were filled with stories. Each one sharing their favorite parts of the exhibit. Each eager to learn more. John listened, his heart swelling with pride. He could see their confidence growing, their sense of self deepening. And he knew that this journey they were on, this journey of discovery and belonging, was just beginning. But it wasn't always easy. With their newfound sense of pride came new challenges. As the girls became more aware of the subtle and not so subtle ways the world sometimes saw them differently. Tiana, his strong-willed athlete, faced whispers from her teammates, some of whom questioned why she was different from her family. Zoe found herself questioning her own identity, struggling to understand how she fit into a world that sometimes felt confusing and contradictory. One evening, Tiana came home from basketball practice, her face flushed with frustration. She threw her bag onto the floor and crossed her arms, her eyes blazing. "They think I don't belong on the team," she said, her voice thick with anger. They say I don't fit in with a white family." John felt a surge of anger, but he kept his voice calm. "Tiana," he said, "those people don't define you. You define yourself. You've earned your place on that team because of your skill, your dedication, and your heart. Don't let anyone make you feel less than what you are." Tiana's expression softened, and she nodded, her shoulders relaxing as she looked up at him. "Thanks, Dad," she whispered. "I just needed to hear that." The next few weeks were filled with more conversations like that, each one strengthening the bond between John and his daughters. He was learning that being their father meant not just protecting them, but empowering them, helping them find their own voices, and showing them that they could be proud of who they were, proud of their identity, their culture, and the family they were building together. One Sunday, as they gathered around the dinner table, John looked at each of his daughters, his heart swelling with a love that words could barely contain. "I know I may not understand everything about where you come from, but I want you to know that I see you, all of you, and I'm so proud of the young women you're becoming." The girls exchanged glances, their eyes shining with gratitude and love. "We're proud of you, too, Dad," Amara said, her voice steady. "You didn't have to do any of this, but you chose to, and that means more than you know." As they joined hands around the table, John felt a deep sense of peace wash over him. He knew the road ahead would have its challenges, but they were stronger now, fortified by love, understanding, and a shared commitment to one another. In that moment, as they sat together, their hands linked, their hearts bound by an unbreakable bond, John knew that they were, in every sense of the word, a family. One chilly autumn afternoon, John received a call from the principal's office that stopped him in his tracks. Simone had been in a fight at school. Quiet, artistic Simone, the girl who would rather spend hours painting or reading than getting involved in confrontation, had apparently thrown a punch. John felt a mix of disbelief and worry as he drove to the school, his mind racing. When he arrived, he was greeted by Mrs. Garrett, the school principal, whose stern expression softened slightly when she saw the concern on his face. "She's in my office," Mrs. Garrett said, leading him down the hallway. "It's very out of character for Simone, but I'm afraid the incident was serious enough to warrant suspension." John nodded, bracing himself as he entered the room. There, sitting with her head down, was Simone. Her shoulders were tense, her hands gripping the edge of the chair, her face a mask of stubborn anger. He sat beside her, reaching out to place a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Simone," he said softly, "what happened?" For a moment, she didn't look up, her face flushed with shame. Finally, she glanced his way, her eyes filled with a mixture of anger and hurt that took him by surprise. They were saying things about us," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "About how we don't look like a real family. That I don't have a real dad. And then one of them said something about you, Dad, that you were just doing this because you felt sorry for us." Her voice broke, and she looked down, her fists clenched. I couldn't take it." John felt a surge of protectiveness, his own anger simmering just beneath the surface. He hated the thought of his daughters facing this kind of cruelty. Especially his gentle Simone, whose heart was so sensitive, so full of kindness. He glanced at Mrs. Garrett. His voice firm. I understand that fighting is against school policy. But I think it's important to address why this happened. Simone was defending herself against something that's hard to face at any age, let alone as a child. Mrs. Garrett hesitated, her eyes softening as she looked at Simone. I understand, Mr. Harris. I'll make sure we have a conversation with the other students involved. And we'll do what we can to address this at the root. But we still need to have Simone stay home tomorrow. A suspension, even just for a day, is protocol. John nodded reluctantly. He stood and extended a hand to Simone, who rose slowly, the tension still visible in her posture. As they walked down the hallway, he placed a reassuring arm around her shoulders, feeling the weight of her sadness pressing against him. When they arrived home, he guided her to the living room and sat down beside her on the couch. Simone, I know that must have hurt, he said gently, his voice filled with understanding. But I want you to know that words, no matter how harsh, can't change what's real. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with doubt. But, Dad, they make me feel like I don't belong. Like we're just pretending to be a family. John's heart ached as he listened to her, the weight of her words settling over him. He took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts. Simone, people are always going to say things they don't understand. They'll try to put you in a box, make you feel like you don't belong if you don't look like what they expect. But that doesn't define us. We define us. He reached out, taking her hand in his. You, your sisters, and I were a family because we choose to be. Love isn't about what people see on the outside. It's about what we feel and what we share every day. Those kids don't see what we see, what we have, and that's okay. But that doesn't make what they said true. Simone nodded slowly, her grip on his hand tightening. It just hurts. Dad, I don't want people to think that we're not real. John pulled her into a hug, wrapping his arms around her, wishing he could shield her from every hurt, every careless word that tried to diminish what they had built together. I know, sweetheart, I know, but we'll face this together, one day at a time. And I promise, as long as I'm here, you'll never have to doubt that you're loved, that you belong. The following day, John decided to make the most of Simone's day off. He called the girl's favorite art store in town, buying supplies for a surprise project. When he returned, Simone's face lit up with excitement at the sight of the paints, canvases, and brushes he'd brought. Why don't we create something today? He suggested, smiling. You're always making such beautiful art. Maybe today we can make something special, something that shows the world who we are. Simone's eyes brightened, and soon they were both at the dining table, setting up the canvases and paints. Her sisters joined them one by one, drawn by the colors and the infectious excitement. Together, they decided to paint a mural, each contributing a piece that reflected their unique personalities and dreams. Amara painted a tree with deep roots and strong branches, symbolizing resilience and growth. Tiana painted a basketball soaring through the air, capturing her fierce determination and passion. Zoe painted a stack of books, her love for knowledge and stories evident in every stroke. Layla painted a radiant sun, symbolizing joy and optimism, and Jasmine painted small hearts around the edges, her touch of kindness and peace wrapping around the mural like a gentle embrace. When it was John's turn, he paused, unsure of how to capture the feelings that filled his heart. Finally, he painted a simple house, its walls strong and steady, with 6 windows glowing with warm light. In each window, he painted a small heart, one for each of his daughters, a symbol of the love that bound them all. When they were done, they stepped back to look at their work. The mural was vibrant and alive, a testament to the life they'd built together, each brushstroke capturing a piece of their family. Simone smiled, a tear slipping down her cheek as she took in the mural, seeing herself in every part of it. This, John said, his voice thick with emotion, is who we are, and nothing anyone says can take that away from us. The girls looked at him, their faces alight with pride, their bond feeling stronger than ever. They might face a world that didn't always understand them, that questioned and doubted them. But in this house, They were a family unbreakable, resilient, and bound by a love that defied words. And for the first time since the hurtful words at school, Simone felt that sense of belonging settle deep within her. She knew now that their family was real as any other, built on a foundation that no one could shake. That night, as they sat around the table, laughter and warmth filling the room, John looked at each of his daughters, his heart swelling with gratitude. They were his family, his joy, his pride, and together, they were unstoppable. As winter settled over Millbrook, the family's routine was punctuated by long, cozy nights filled with laughter, storytelling, and cups of hot chocolate. But beneath the warmth and routine, a new determination was stirring within each of John's daughters. The incident at school, along with many small moments of feeling different, had left a lasting impact. And John noticed that his girls were more thoughtful, more introspective as they navigated their world. One evening after dinner, Amara gathered her sisters in the living room, her face serious yet hopeful. "I think it's time we shared our story," she said, her voice steady. "There's so much that people don't understand about us, about families like ours, and maybe if we shared what it's like to be us, it could change something." The idea seemed to light a spark in the room. Each girl had faced her own challenges, her own moments of feeling invisible or misunderstood, and the chance to reclaim their narrative filled them with a sense of purpose. John, sitting in his favorite armchair, listened quietly, pride swelling in his chest. He could see the strength in each of them, the resilience and courage they'd grown into. He gave them a gentle nod. "I think that's a wonderful idea. And I'll be right here, supporting you however I can." Over the next few days, the girls brainstormed ideas on how to tell their story. Amara suggested they start a blog, a place where they could write about their experiences and share them with others. Zoe, ever the reader and aspiring writer, took charge of crafting their first posts, filling pages with stories of family, love, and resilience. Tiana suggested including videos and photos that captured their everyday life, the small moments that showed how they were just like any other family. Layla, ever the performer, offered to do interviews with her sisters, capturing their thoughts and emotions on camera in a way that felt raw and real. Simone offered to create artwork that reflected their experiences. And Jasmine, shy but thoughtful, promised to help her sisters in any way she could. The project quickly became a family affair. Each night, after homework was finished, they gathered around the table, sharing memories, sifting through old photos, and weaving together a narrative that celebrated who they were. They laughed as they remembered funny stories, cried as they recounted challenges, and grew closer with every shared moment. When they finally launched the blog, they named it Heart of a Family, with the tagline, "Love Beyond Blood." Their first post was a simple introduction, each sister contributing a paragraph that shared her voice, her hopes, her dreams. They posted photos of the mural they'd painted together, snapshots of their adventures, and candid moments of laughter and joy. Almost immediately, the response was overwhelming. Comments poured in from people across the country, other families who had faced similar challenges, individuals moved by the strength of their bond, and strangers who saw in them a reminder of the beauty of family in all its forms. One comment from a single mother read, "Thank you for showing the world that family is about love, not appearances. I've felt so alone trying to raise my son as a transracial adoptive family. But your story gives me hope." Another came from a high school teacher who wrote, "Your words have inspired me to make my classroom a more inclusive space. Thank you for your bravery." Reading these messages, John felt his heart swell with pride. His daughters were doing more than sharing their story, they were inspiring change. Showing people that love, understanding, and acceptance could bridge any divide. As weeks turned into months, the blog continued to grow. The girls hosted Q&A sessions, answering questions from readers about their lives, their challenges, and what family meant to them. They talked openly about the moments that had hurt, about the strength they'd found in each other, and about how they'd learned to embrace both their differences and their similarities. One evening, as they were wrapping up a session, John noticed Amara scrolling through her phone with a smile on her face. She looked up, her eyes shining. "Dad, We got an email from a local news station. They want to interview us, our whole family. The room fell silent as everyone looked at John, waiting for his response. His heart skipped a beat at the thought of stepping into the public eye. But when he looked at his daughters' eager faces, he knew that this was an opportunity to amplify their message. All right, he said, smiling. Let's do it. A week later, they found themselves sitting in a small television studio, bright lights shining down on them as a reporter prepared to interview them. John was nervous, but his daughters sat beside him, radiating confidence. They'd come a long way from the uncertain girls he'd first welcomed into his home. And seeing them now, strong and assured, filled him with pride. The interview was a mix of questions about their family, their blog, and the journey that had brought them to this point. Each girl spoke openly, their voices steady as they shared what family meant to them and how they'd learned to define it on their own terms. Amara spoke about finding her voice as the eldest sister, taking on responsibilities and learning to protect those she loved. Tiana talked about the challenges of being a black athlete in a predominantly white school, how she'd learned to stand tall despite the whispers and the stares. Zoe shared her love for books and the power of storytelling, and how the blog had become a way to reclaim their story and share it with the world. Layla talked about embracing her identity and using her voice to stand up for others, while Jasmine spoke softly about the joy of having a family that loved her unconditionally. Finally, the reporter turned to John, her expression warm. Mr. Harris, you've done something extraordinary, raising 6 daughters from backgrounds different from your own. What has this journey taught you about family and love? John paused, his gaze drifting to each of his daughters before answering. This journey has taught me that family is a choice we make every day. It's not about looking the same or having the same background. It's about showing up for each other, loving unconditionally, and embracing everything that makes us unique. My daughters have taught me that love has no boundaries. They've shown me what it truly means to be a family, and I wouldn't trade that for anything. The girls reached out, each one taking his hand, their faces alight with gratitude and love. When the interview aired, it was met with an outpouring of support. Their story was shared widely, touching hearts and inspiring countless people who saw in them a reflection of what family could be. The girls began receiving letters from teachers, students, and families alike, each one sharing how their story had made an impact. But it was the final letter of the night that touched John the most. It was from an older man, a retired police officer who'd read about their story in the local paper. Seeing you with your daughters reminds me of what's truly important. He wrote, thank you for showing the world that love is stronger than anything that tries to divide us. You've reminded me that there's always room to grow, to love, and to accept. As he read the words, John felt a deep sense of peace settle over him. His daughters' voices were changing the world, one story at a time. They were proving that family could look different, that love could be found in the most unexpected places, and that together, they could face anything. And as they closed up the laptop for the night, John hugged each of his girls, feeling the weight of their journey settle into a kind of quiet strength. They had found their voice, and he knew that, wherever life took them next, they would always have a place where they belonged. In that small living room, surrounded by his daughters, John felt a certainty that transcended every challenge, every fear. They were a family, bound not by blood, but by choice, by love, and by the strength of a story they had written together. Spring had come to Millbrook, painting the town in soft pastels, and with it came a milestone that John had both eagerly anticipated and quietly dreaded. His girls were growing up, each one preparing to step into a new chapter of life. Amara was set to graduate from college, and Simone had been accepted into an art residency program out of state. Tiana had received a full athletic scholarship to a university, and Zoe was busy working on her first book with the encouragement of her publisher. Layla had been selected as a youth ambassador for a social justice organization. And little Jasmine, though still in high school, was already dreaming of ways to make a difference in the world. In the weeks leading up to Amara's graduation, the house felt alive with energy. Bags were packed, plans were made, and laughter echoed through the rooms as the sisters teased each other, shared advice, and talked about the future. Yet, beneath the excitement, There was a sense of bittersweet nostalgia and knowledge that things were about to change. One evening, as they all sat around the dining table for dinner, John raised his glass, his voice thick with emotion. "I want to say how proud I am of each of you. Watching you grow has been the greatest privilege of my life. You've all become strong, kind, and determined women, and I know you're going to change the world." The girls lifted their glasses, smiling, though a hint of sadness danced in their eyes. They knew that life was pulling them in different directions, that this was one of the last times they would all sit around this table together. "Dad," Amara began, her voice filled with gratitude, "we owe it all to you. You took us in, gave us a home, and taught us what it means to be a family." John's heart swelled, and he shook his head, a soft smile touching his lips. "No, girls, you taught me, every day. You reminded me of the power of love, resilience, and courage. I may have given you a home, but you gave me a family." Over the next few days, they prepared for Amara's graduation celebration. The ceremony itself was a grand affair, held in the college's sprawling green courtyard, with family and friends filling every seat. As Amara's name was called, John's heart raced with pride as she walked across the stage, her head held high, her smile radiant. It was a moment of pure joy, a culmination of years of hard work, love, and perseverance. After the ceremony, they gathered in the backyard for a family party. Friends, neighbors, and members of their church came to celebrate. Amara stood to make a speech, her voice carrying a warmth that echoed through the night. "I stand here today as a college graduate because of the love that surrounded me every step of the way," she began, looking around at her family and friends. "Dad, you showed me that family is a choice. That love can build bridges stronger than any challenges. And to my sisters," she said, her voice breaking slightly, "we've been through so much together. You've been my rock, my laughter, my strength. I couldn't have done it without you." The night was filled with laughter, hugs, and countless toasts, each one celebrating the journey they had taken together. As the evening wore on, and the guests began to leave, the sisters gathered around John in the living room. Just as they had so many times before, Amara looked at her father, a soft smile on her face. "Dad, we have something for you," she said, her voice filled with emotion. She handed him a small, leather-bound book. Inside were letters from each of the girls, sharing memories, expressing their gratitude, and reflecting on the journey they'd taken together. There were photos, drawings by Simone, and even a few short poems by Zoe. Each page was filled with the love and gratitude they felt for him. A legacy bound in ink and paper. John's hands trembled as he turned the pages, his eyes misting as he read their words, each one a testament to the life they'd shared. He looked up, his heart overflowing with emotion. This means more to me than I can say. Thank you, girls. I'll treasure this always." As the sisters huddled around him, each one resting her head on his shoulder or squeezing his hand, they sat in comfortable silence, savoring the closeness of family. A few weeks later, on a warm Saturday afternoon, John received another surprise. Amara had arranged for them all to visit the community center to see the progress of a mural that she, Simone, and Layla had designed. When they arrived, John's breath caught as he took in the mural, a vibrant, sweeping scene depicting a tree with roots that ran deep and strong, each branch adorned with leaves bearing the names of families from the community. At the heart of the mural was an image of their own family, John surrounded by his daughters, their faces etched in loving detail. Beneath it were the words, "Love beyond blood, a family rooted in strength." John felt his heart swell as he looked at the mural, his eyes tracing each familiar face. This is beautiful," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. Amara squeezed his hand. "It's our way of giving back, of honoring everything you've given us. This mural is for you, for our family, and for everyone who's learned that family can look different but still be filled with love." As they stood there, admiring the mural, people began to gather around. Neighbors, friends, and strangers alike, each one pausing to take in the scene and the powerful message it conveyed. John felt a sense of peace settle over him, a profound gratitude for the life he'd built with his daughters. Later that evening, as they returned home, John found himself alone on the porch. The soft glow of the setting sun casting a warm light over the quiet town. He thought back to the day he'd first brought his daughters home. Uncertain and a little afraid, but filled with hope. He'd worried that he might not be enough, that he wouldn't know how to be the father they needed. But now, sitting on the porch, with the love of his daughters etched in his heart and on the walls of their town, he knew he had been given a gift beyond measure. One by one, his daughters joined him, each finding a place beside him. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars blink into the darkening sky, each one a reminder of the countless memories they'd created together. Finally, Amara spoke, her voice soft and filled with love. "Dad, thank you for everything, for choosing us, for believing in us, and for teaching us that family is something you create with love. Not just blood." John smiled, pulling them all into a hug, feeling the warmth of their love surround him. "Thank you, girls, for being my family. You've given my life more meaning and joy than I ever thought possible." As they sat there, wrapped in each other's embrace, John knew that his legacy was not in wealth or achievements, but in the love he had poured into his family. His daughters would carry that love forward, spreading it into the world, creating their own families, leaving a mark on every life they touched. In that moment, John felt a deep, unshakable peace. He had done his job well. He had raised daughters who were proud of who they were, who understood the power of love, resilience, and family, and no matter where life took them, they would always be bound by the unbreakable threads of love that had brought them together. The stars shimmered overhead as the family sat together, a testament to the strength of love and the beauty of chosen family. They were, and always would be, a family rooted in strength, resilience, and love beyond measure.